trains were always special to me. Magical and mystical, they provided stability in an otherwise crazy, complicated world of World War II and the early days of the Cold War. As a boy growing up in rural northwestern Pennsylvania, I always ran outside whenever I heard a train coming. It was the natural thing to do. As the sleek cars flew by, I stood transfixed, knowing they were bound for some faraway place that I'd only read about. I had heard about the Great Broadway Limited or the 20th Century Limited, and many times I asked myself, would I ever be able to ride on them? I saw the passengers sitting comfortably on their seats, reading and talking. Where were they going? Since I didn't have a clue, I allowed my imagination to run afar. I envisioned a scene from Strangers on a Train, where Farley Granger and Robert Walker casually plotted two murders over an elegant lunch. After listening to my favorite radio shows on cold winter nights, I would go to bed and listen for the 11 o'clock flyer whistle at the Tanbayan crossing 3 miles away. I knew Butch Preshock was at the throttle because of the sound of his whistle. By the time the train roared past my house, I could hear Butch increase power so that the train could make the steep climb to Kane. Frequently, it was the last thing I heard before falling asleep. All was well in my world, for I knew that old number 898 was right on schedule. Ah yes, I can hear it now. Now, a half-century later, my fond memories of yesteryear begin to take shape again. It reminds me of an ancient Scottish folk tale about a village that rises from the fog and comes to life for 24 hours a day, once every century. Obviously, a charming and quaint fable, but who believes in fables these days? But wait a minute. What is that sound? It's coming from the fog. Is it a whistle? There it is again. Are my ears playing tricks on me? Let's follow the Northern Express on its historic trek as it helps us relive the railroad's halcyon days. How did the Pence's line between Philadelphia and Erie become a reality? What is the mysterious hold railroads have upon us, whether it be engines or luxury cars or the railroad stations of bygone days? Nor can we forget how the Pennsylvania Railroad literally put towns on the map, helping them become viable parts of a larger commerce. Therefore, when the Northern Express passes through the towns between Emporium and Corry, let's stop briefly to learn a little about each of those places.
The Northern Express was an excursion train of 8 passenger cars that swept westward on Amtrak from Philadelphia to Harrisburg, where 2 more cars were added. Running on the Norfolk Southern tracks, it proceeded north along the Susquehanna River to Sunbury and Williamsport. It joined the Allegheny and Eastern Railroad in Emporium, Pennsylvania, and continued west for another 150 miles to Erie. The next morning, the Express struck out for Pittsburgh, 100 miles to the south. Speeding along on CSX rails to Conneaut, Ohio, the train then switched to the Bessemer and Lake Erie, next onto the North Bessemer, and finally onto the Union Railroad. Crossing the historic Monongahela River, it stopped at the site of the old Homestead Steelworks. Then, retracing its path, the train returned to Butler for the evening. The next day, it followed the Buffalo and Pittsburgh Railroad to Punxsutawney, DuBois, and to Falls Creek, where it eventually joined the ex-Pennsylvania Railroad low-grade line to Driftwood. Then, the train headed back to Harrisburg and on to Philadelphia, making the circle complete. The Northern Express was powered by 2 E8 diesels, numbers 5711 and 5809. They were restored under the watchful eyes of owner Bennett Levin. When asked about the restorations, he replied, "Not only did we have the facility and the machinery to undertake the restoration, but also my son Eric had the knowledge, skill, experience, and passion to manage the process. The task of restoration was a major project requiring everything, including tender loving care. Finally, when the refurbished engines came from the terminal, they had been restored to their former glory. True to the Pennsylvania Railroad design, right down to the line's traditional Tuscan and gold colors, and sporting a framed keystone, the railroad symbol. According to Bennett Levin, the importance of these restorations ensured that they would run again in Pennsylvania, rather than becoming an engine house queen show in a museum setting as a static display. The 10 vintage passenger cars that left the Harrisburg station that bright August day were all privately owned, including Levin's private car, the Pennsylvania, that brought up the rear of the train. According to Levin, this trip was significant in another way. The partnership of the Harrisburg and Watauga Valley chapters in operating the Watauga coach allowed affordable accommodations to become available to those who would have otherwise not been able to enjoy the experience. This had never been done before on a similar type excursion.
The Conestoga wagon was to travel in the mid-19th century as the railroad streamliner was to mid-20th century travel. The former represented the means to get to new lands that were often fraught with peril, while the latter symbolized the finest form of land transportation known to man. The streamliners and their magnificent, sleek cars spanned America from coast to coast. Even though people could travel by auto or air, passengers found that the streamliners offered first-class accommodations equal to that of any luxury steamship. The railroads lavished passengers with streamliners, speed, and marvelous food.
The engines were sleek and fast, and the cars literally floated above the rails, providing the passenger with a myriad of creature comforts. The streamliners raced across the country from Washington to Florida, from Maine to California. The engines and cars were physically beautiful. The engines took on an aerodynamic appearance, looking fast and sleek. The observation cars and the Vista Domes sported an aluminum skin that glittered in the bright light. The Vista Domes and observation cars provided an unparalleled view. The passenger could sit back in a comfortable chair and watch the magnificent scenery go by. She could lounge in a plush parlor car, then call for a porter for a menu that offered multiple course dinners. Regarding the cuisine, one passenger gushed, "Floating high above the rails in a glass-enclosed dining room provides a culinary treat unknown to anyone." Even though the streamliners were fast, a person really didn't recognize it unless he had a schedule in hand. Every trip seemed to be at a leisurely pace, with the convenience of the passenger first and foremost. If a passenger took the 20th Century Limited, he could board at Grand Central Station in New York at 6 p.m. and eat an unhurried meal before topping off the evening with an excellent wine. Comfortable sleeping facilities allowed him to fall asleep easily to the gentle motion of the train and the mesmerizing hum of the wheels on the rails. The next morning, he would be awakened in time for a hearty breakfast before arriving in the Windy City at 9 a.m. The lounge cars were places where passengers could come together to talk quietly or just to pass the time of day while enjoying the beautiful scenery. And as a car salesman would say, "This Vista car is loaded." This car from the Burlington line had a full galley on the lower level. It contained a dumbwaiter to deliver food to the front of the observation car on the second level. Some cars contained a small dining room tucked away on the lower level. where more intimate dinners would be served. There was a mystique about the streamliners. It was romantic and charming. And for over a quarter of a century, it was truly the only way to travel.
The Pennsylvania Railroad, originally the Philadelphia and Erie Railroad, became a giant within the industry. Its original founders hoped that by connecting Philadelphia with Erie, Pennsylvania, a huge empire would be born. But for many reasons, this dream never reached fruition. But undeniably, this route opened a huge portion of Pennsylvania to settlement and economic development.
In the early 1860s, the railroad had already reached Emporium from the south. 70 miles away, the eastern terminus from Erie was Warren. The race was on to complete the remaining stretch of tracks. In August 1864, work crews comprised of Italian and other southern European immigrants, embossed by Irish foremen, met near Tambine, a tiny settlement between Wilcox and Johnsonburg.
My great-grandfather, William McMahon, was a foreman of a work crew working from Emporium westward. In fact, his son, my grandfather, William McMahon, was born in a railroad shanty near Driftwood as the work on the road progressed westward. Grampy, we all called him, was very proud of his father's role in railroad building. He never tired of retelling his father's story about the railroad executives' inability with the hammer. When they attempted to drive the silver spike, he recounted, about every other blow was a complete miss.
As the years progressed, major classification yards were built in Harrisburg, Sunbury, Renova, and Erie. Not only were cars and engines repaired there, new trains were made up and sent to other destinations. Other towns like Warren, Kane, Ridgway, and Emporium also had significant railroad repair and storage yards. Through these installations, the railroad provided thousands of jobs. Emporium, the county seat of Cameron County, is located within the steep folds of the Allegheny Mountains. It is intersected by a tributary to the west branch of the Susquehanna River. This geographic convergence profoundly affected Emporium's early history. As a result, the stream played a significant role in the region's logging and sawmill era. Emporium also had a tannery because of the ready availability of hemlock bark. During the Great Depression, the United States government established 3 civilian conservation corps camps in Cameron County, one within 2 miles of Emporium. Not only did the CCC help transform the environment of the area, it served as an important economic stimulus. Many young men of Cameron County rushed to join the CCC because it provided a job for them and immediate financial aid to their families.
The Sylvania Company, however, was the linchpin of the area's economy. Dating back to the 1920s, Sylvania manufactured radio tubes and lights. The company in its heyday employed well over 1,000 people, mostly women, and was featured nationally in a Collier's magazine article that claimed Emporium had a ratio of 20 women to every man. Some CCC veterans told me they came back and settled here simply because of that ratio. There was a better chance of their finding a wife. Regardless of this statistic, Sylvania played a very significant role in defeating the Axis powers. The railroad did not come about easily. Having its power base in Philadelphia and boasting supporters such as Nicholas Biddle, the most powerful banker in the United States at that time, it took almost a generation to complete the road. The railroad's slow evolution was fraught with intrigue, maneuvering, intense lobbying, and the use of political and economic power. One of the largest bones of contention occurred over the selection of the route between Emporium and Warren.
Robert Ferries, chief engineer of the line, recommended a southern route from Ridgway to Sheffield. Leaving Ridgway, the proposed route traveled between the Clarion River and Mill Creek, across the Spring Creek summit, From there, it proceeded to the southern branch of the Tionesta Valley through Barnes to Sheffield. Ferry's proposal died of lack of political support. General Thomas L. Kane, the savior of the Mormons and a Civil War hero, must receive major credit for the northern route from Ridgway through Kane and Sheffield.
A Philadelphia native who enjoyed strong state and national economic and political connections, Kane became the agent of the Elk McKean Land Improvement Company, a Philadelphia-based company. He traveled to the area, mapping, surveying, and sending reports back to the company. Ultimately, he built a house in Elk County before founding and settling Kane, PA. Upon his advice, the Elk McKean Company bought significant parcels of land in the area, as did the general, I might add. During this time, Kane lobbied with his friend John Thompson, who will eventually become president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. The final decision was a no-brainer. Kane's political clout and economic connections paid off.
It's small wonder that in 1868, the Thompson Hotel, named after the railroad president, opened adjacent to the railroad station in Kane, Pennsylvania. The Thompson Hotel was an elegant hotel, considered to have been the finest resort hotel on the entire line. Railroad builders had to be keenly aware of the railroad bed's grade. The northern route was no exception. Steep grades simply cost more money. A 1% grade exists when a track rises 1 foot per 100 feet of track. If it rises 2 feet per 100 feet, it is then a 2% grade. However, the route from Emporium to Warren contained 2 significant grades. The St. Mary's grade from Emporium averaged 1%, while the Kane grade from Wilcox was even steeper, approaching nearly 2% at East Kane. This meant that most freight trains would require helper engines, an additional expense for the company. A warm, late August shower failed to dampen the enthusiasm of the St. Mary's rail fans as they lined the streets to greet the Northern Express. This scene was not unusual. It was duplicated many times throughout the Northern Express's route. People instinctively knew the historical significance of this trip. It was little wonder that the kids placed nickels and dimes on the track, for these flattened coins would become souvenirs, fond remembrances for the rest of their lives. St. Mary's most famous son, Andrew Call, was a business genius whose impact upon the community is still significant. Everything he touched was successful, from a logging and sawmill business to a brewery, from a sewage pipe company to railroading. But perhaps his greatest contribution was the financial aid he gave John Spear, who helped create Spear Carbon Industry. Call's business partner, James Hall, in turn helped to finance the Stackpole Carbon Company. Railroads also contributed to the town's economy. In addition to the Pennsylvania Railroad, the Pittsburgh, Shawmut, and Northern Railroad maintained a huge shop there until 1947, when it closed. Although business thrives in the community, St. Mary's possesses the quiet charm of a small town. It has many amenities of a much larger community, which makes it attractive to all. Since railroads were considered the greatest of man's technological creations, it was only logical that the railroad stations, at least in the larger cities, would become monuments befitting the locomotive status. These stations were America's versions of European castles, and certainly symbolic of that era. In Southside Pittsburgh, the Pennsylvania and Lake Erie Railroad Station stood 8 stories high and was certainly representative of a great corporation.
In 1952, I enlisted in the United States Army. I had to report to Fort Meade, Maryland for induction. That meant that I left Wilcox and went to Pittsburgh and boarded a train at the Pennsylvania and Lake Erie Railroad Station. And when I went into that station, I was awestruck. I paused on the top of the elegant marble steps that cascaded gracefully down to the station's main concourse. Magnificent marble pillars rose breathtakingly to the ceilings. As I walked down the elegant stairway, it seemed right out of a Cecil B. DeMille movie epic. At this point, I wouldn't have been surprised if a legion of Roman soldiers had marched through. As I learned later, this grandness and opulence awaited all who entered the portals of any major station in the nation.
Across town, the Pennsylvania Railroad had built a magnificent railroad castle. A 12-story office building, it was richly decorated to impress the visitor while simultaneously paying homage to the railroad era. Like Christmas past, the station was decorated for the holidays, while automobiles waited outside to pick up passengers on Christmas Eve. The Lackawanna Station at Scranton, Pennsylvania, continued the opulent tradition as railroad companies competed with each other to build a fitting mansion for the mighty locomotive. Upon entrance to any metropolitan railroad station, the passenger walked into a museum, flanked by multicolored ceiling windows, beautiful paintings, and of course, marble everywhere.
At Wilcox, where I grew up, the railroad station served as a meeting place for the community. If you sat there long enough, half the town passed through its doors, maybe just to talk with Tony, the station master. Others wanted to gawk at the new Chevy cars that had just been unloaded. And a few people checked up on the arrival of a catalog order. Some just wanted to pass the time of day, or maybe to nib-nose in an effort to see who was getting what. Regardless, the railroad station, big or small, served as the center of commerce for every community. The railroad was truly king.
In smaller towns, the opulence gave way to practicality. The stations seemed to be made from the same architectural plan. 1 or 2 story buildings, they were constructed of brick and wood. Many had wooden floors that turned a dull brown color over the years of constant use. They were neat, efficient buildings filled with the hustle and bustle of local commerce. In 1920, there were over 18,000 railroad stations in the nation. The number began to dwindle rapidly after World War II. Sadly, only a small percentage of these buildings remain today, mostly in larger towns and cities where rail service remains. Fortunately, some of the stations avoided the wrecking ball when public and private interests converted them into museums or private businesses. The Lackawanna Station in Scranton and Pittsburgh's Pennsylvania Lake Erie Railroad Station serve as stirring examples of what once was, while at the same time both have top-rated restaurants located in their concourses. On a much less spectacular basis, the B&O Station in Ridgeway was once a restaurant. More recently, it houses a small business, totally unrelated to railroad history. The Pennsylvania Station in Kane has been renovated and helps preserve the history of the community and serves as a vital link with the past. All of these buildings have a rich past. It is fortunate that we are able to enjoy their presence. Some stations have not been that fortunate. They have not been refurbished, nor have they been raised. Like dowager queens who have seen better days, they are withering away with the passage of time, stark and neglected and almost ghost-like in appearance. They carry us back into a time when railroads were central to transportation everywhere, and the optimism railroads evoked was unbounded. They stand here today to remind us of our own mortality, especially when one realizes the Pennsylvania Railroad originally leased the line from Philadelphia to Erie for 999 years. The Pensy's reigned, but was for a little more than a century. Little remains today, except fading memories of those who can remember that far back. Ridgeway, the county seat of Elk County, is a pretty little town situated on the upper reaches of the Clarion River. Railroads had always been a prominent part of the town. The Pennsylvania Railroad opened up the town to statewide commerce by 1864. Within 2 decades, the Buffalo, Rochester, and Pittsburgh Railroad, later the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, punched its way northward from Brockway and DuBois from Pittsburgh. By 1910, the Pensy and the BR&P had built new stations across town from each other. Then, the 2 lines paralleled each other to Johnsonburg, 8 miles west from Ridgeway. From there, the BR&P turned north to Bradford and ultimately to Buffalo and Rochester, while the Pensy continued west to Warren and Erie. The railroads contributed to the town's economy, as did the Russell Snowplow Company, which greatly aided the railroad's efficiency during the wintertime. Wood and wood-related products influenced the community's well-being. Sawmills and planing mills employed hundreds of people. The Hyde Murphy Company planed lumber for the immediate use of area builders. It also supplied fine wood products for the entire nation. However, it was the Elk Tanning Company, the kingpin of the United Leather Company, that became the chief industrial player in the town because of the ready accessibility to hemlock bark, the source of tannic acid necessary in the tanning process. Within a few short miles of Ridgway was a 40,000-acre virgin hemlock forest, ripe for the picking. By 1900, there were over 100 tanneries in the state, 2 in Ridgway and another 5 in Elk County. The tanneries and logging sawmill companies voraciously attacked the forests. By 1940, the magnificent forest had been reduced to stumps and treetops. Adjacent to the Elk Tanning Company was the Ridgway Kutztohl plant. This business prepared leather for a number of other finished products. On the western edge of town was the Elliott Company. During World War II, this plant manufactured component parts for submarine motors. Later, the company did research and development for the U.S. Navy in an effort to develop a quieter submarine motor. In the early days of the Pennsylvania Railroad's run between Emporium and Warren, it was said that the engines ran with their lights on during the day because of the forest's dense overstory shut out the rays of the sun. By the early 20th century, this was no longer true. The area's industries had begun their successful assault upon the virgin forest. As the Northern Express traverses this same line in 2001, it is passing through many charming towns and villages. Its passengers are riding through some of the most beautiful scenery in Pennsylvania's northern tier. Through wise government and private management, the forest has been allowed to regenerate, and the streams paralleling the line are clean and pure. The winters are crisp and cold. Spring and summer feature lush greenery, and the hardwood forests' blaze of colors in the fall is unparalleled. This trip allowed the passengers the best of two worlds. They are participating in a historic event, while at the same time enjoying some of Pennsylvania's best scenery. David Johnson and his wife built a cabin at the junction of the east and west branches of the Clarion River. Eventually, this settlement was called Cooperstown. With the arrival of the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1864, the town began to grow. Later, it was renamed Quay after the powerful Pennsylvania political leader. In 1888, the first paper mill was built, and 3 years later, the borough of Johnsonburg was incorporated. Johnsonburg, the paper city, has been home to the paper industry for over a century. It once produced the paper used by the Curtis Publishing Company that owned and operated the Saturday Evening Post. Its large woodyard had become a familiar scene over the years to those who passed through the community. Founded by Colonel Alonzo I. Wilcox in the mid-1850s, Wilcox benefited from being on the Pennsylvania's main line. Colonel Wilcox lived in an 18-room, 3-story mansion where he and his wife entertained dignitaries from the area. General Kane and his wife visited often, sometimes by handcar. Thomas Struthers of Warren, James Gillis of Ridgway, and Rasselas Brown were also Wilcox's friends. Struthers and Gillis were powerful supporters of the railroad, and Brown, as well as Gillis, served in the United States Congress. President Ulysses S. Grant visited Wilcox in 1872 and again in 1877. During his first visit, Grant was arrested by the McKean County Sheriff, a Democrat, for fishing on Sunday. It seems that the president had waded over from Elk County to the McKean County side of Williamsville Creek. Consequently, the President of the United States was busted by the awaiting sheriff. General Kane graciously paid the fine, and the president continued his fishing. Originally, Wilcox was called Buena Vista, a beautiful view. By the mid-1930s, the main highway through town was lined with magnificent maple trees, impressing visitors and giving credence to its initial name. The railroad provided many jobs to the townspeople. Tower operators controlled traffic from Emporium to Erie because many of the stretches of the road were single track. Almost every town had a section crew that maintained the track diligently. The town also had a glass factory and a bottle factory. These did not survive the Great Depression, however. But the mainstay of the community was the tannery, owned by the Elk Tanning Company, reputedly the largest tannery in the world. This facility processed more than 50,000 buffalo hides in the 1870s, in addition to millions of cattle hides. The powerhouse supplied steam power for the tannery. Generally, it took about 2 months for a hide to be processed into leather. When the hides left the hide house, they were put into a series of vats where they were washed and softened in a mixture of varying strengths of lime water. This tannery had over 150 vats dug into the ground that were 8 feet by 8 feet by 5 feet deep. Each vat held 100 hides. These vats took up over half the space of the entire tannery. After a couple of weeks of additional soaking, the hides reached the beam house, where workers took the hides from the lime-filled vats and ran them through the hair machine.
Although my dad retired from the tannery after 30 years, I worked there for only 4 months in 1952. My friend Fuzzy and I operated the hair machine. The work required a minimum of gray matter, but a great deal of brute force. The hair machine was a Stephen King nightmare. Just as the name implied, it removed hair from the hide. The machine was a box-like contraption 10 feet wide and perhaps 8 feet high. It had an ominous 7-foot wide serrated roller anchored at the bottom of the machine 3 feet below the floor level. Attached to both sides of the machine, the roller spun upward on a small track at a 45-degree angle to approximately our waist level. We would take a hide from a pile of wet hides that lay to our rear and flip that hide into the machine while Fuzzy and I held on to a shank of the hide. Then Fuzzy activated the roller. The jaws of the machine slammed shut and the roller rapidly moved toward us while removing practically all of the hair from the hide. When the roller reached the tops, the jaws reopened. We flipped the hide to our rear while simultaneously turning it over and threw the hide back into the machine. The jaws closed with a massive clunk, and the process repeated itself, only this time it removed excess skin as well as assorted gunk from the hides. Our quota was 250 hides daily.
Afterward, workers using long, sharp knives placed the hides on beams, where they removed the fleshings and the remaining hair from each hide. The fleshings went to the glue factory, and the hides were headed to the rocker machines. Here, fermentic tannic acid was added to the hides, and the hides were gently agitated for 2 weeks in this chemically prepared mix. Taken out, they were packed in a bark extract for a few days before being put back into vats, where they were soaked in a stronger strength of tannic acid. Finally, the hides reached the finishing area, where they were split and bleached with sal soda. In the roll house, the hides were massaged with talcum powder, fish oil, kerosene, or Epsom salts, depending upon the finish desired. Finally, each hide was run through a brass roller to eliminate excess liquids and hung in the drying loft, where steam heat helped to complete the tanning process. On July 22, 1966, the Wilcox Tannery was totally destroyed by a fire of unknown origin. It marked the sad end to what was once an empire. The Wilcox Tannery was part of the United Leather Company, the 10th largest business in the country in 1910. After 1945, the tanneries began to close one by one, victims of foreign competition, the introduction of artificial leather products, and the company's inability or unwillingness to modernize. Every town but Kane on the Pennsylvania Railroad line from Emporium to Sheffield had at least one tannery. Consequently, the area suffered a substantial loss of jobs. In 1966, when the smokestack at the Wilcox Tannery was imploded, the once mighty empire passed into oblivion. General Kane built a house in Summit, as Kane was first called in the early 1860s. The house stood where Kane High School is presently located. In the early days of the town, Kane and his wife, Elizabeth, were the mother, father, doctor, and nurse, and personal advisors to the people who lived here. Kane suffered financial setbacks that would have destroyed a lesser man. His sawmill burned to the ground in 1868, and later, when the general was in Utah, his friend altered a check that almost destroyed the general. By the mid-1870s, his land investments were paying off, which prompted his grandson to say, "Grandfather was becoming wealthy in spite of himself." General Kane entertained President Grant twice during the 1870s. During a fishing trip on the upper reaches of the Clarion River's East Branch, the president insisted on riding Old Clarion, Kane's wartime horse. If allowed, the horse had a habit of rolling over in a stream. Grant, the expert horseman, ignored the warning, and sure enough, when they crossed the Williamsville Creek, the horse and the president ended up soaked. The general was a greater idealist than a soldier or a politician. His utopian bent led to recruiting people from Sweden to come and live here. Kane felt that the Swedes possessed the attributes that would help the community physically and morally. The general, founder of the Bucktail Regiment, distinguished himself in the Shenandoah Campaign and later at Gettysburg. He is buried here in a chapel maintained by the Mormons. Because of northwestern Pennsylvania's abundant hardwood forests, Kane became home to the Holgate Toy Company, one of the first companies to research and develop the preschool toy market for children. Many of the most popular Holgate toys were designed by Jarvis Rockwell, Norman Rockwell's brother. Jarvis Rockwell's work earned him recognition as one of America's finest toy designers. From a public relations standpoint, Kane had two attractions that made its name familiar throughout Pennsylvania. It was the home of the Lobo Wolves, the only wolves of their kind in the country. It was also known as the Icebox of Pennsylvania, frequently recording the coldest temperatures and largest amount of snowfall in Pennsylvania. At one point, Bennett Levin waxed poetic about the trip. The run was one of life's small pleasures. Good speed, moderate temperatures, low humidity, and a low bright sun of the late summer afternoon, and the sounds of the horn, together with the aroma of spent fuel, set the mood as those of us who could watched from the Dutch doors as 5711 led 5809 and the 10 privates through the gentle curves and small towns. With the completion of the Pennsylvania Railroad, Sheffield began to grow, with an emphasis upon the raw materials of the forest which surrounded the town. This period forever secured the town's link to the forest. In 1893, the Horton and Crary Tannery dominated the town. At the same time, the U.S. Leather Company was created by a merger of over 60 tanneries in the state. Recognizing the potential of their holdings, the Leather Company decided to sell no more logs to outside contractors. Instead, it created the Central Pennsylvania Lumber Company to log hemlock for the bark for the tanneries, as well as sawing and marketing all timber from its holdings. Charles Horton of Sheffield became the first president of the CPL and immediately began plans for a mammoth mill, which would soon become the crown jewel of the CPL's empire. He designed and built a state-of-the-art sawmill at Sheffield, capable of sawing nearly 200,000 board feet a day. Constructed of reinforced concrete, it was virtually fireproof. Fuel for the steam-driven generators came from burning the mill's waste wood and sawdust. Even the 80 company houses built by the mill were supplied with electricity generated from the mill. The excess sawdust was sold as far away as Buffalo, New York. Nothing was wasted, making the mill a mecca for efficiency experts who visited from all over the nation. The CPL controlled vast forest tracts in the triangle of land between the Clarion and Allegheny Rivers. From 1920 to 1930, the CPL cut nearly 25,000 acres of virgin hemlock, mostly in the Bear Creek area of Elk County. The bark went to the area tanneries, while all the logs were transported to the Sheffield Mill on the Tionesta Valley Railroad, a narrow-gauge railroad owned by the CPL. The TV Railroad employed 125 men, owned a huge rolling stock inventory. It operated 80 miles of mainline track and another 200 miles of secondary track. Interestingly enough, much of its main line followed the same route proposed by Robert Ferries in 1862 for the main line of the Pennsylvania Railroad. The work in the field in the sawmill was dangerous. Log cars were loaded by 2 men. One man, throwing the tongs, had to hit the center of each log so that the log would not swing wildly. This would endanger the man who was building the load. After the log train had been loaded, it traveled to Sheffield on tracks that were barely stable. Deb Silvas describes what happened one day en route to the mill.
I was on a train that wrecked. I was braking. A fellow named Felton was the conductor. We had 40 cars of logs. It was on a steep hill going down, and the car wrecked. Well, the train ran away, unhooked, got away from the pile, and the car just went up. There was 14 cars in one pile, and my uncle went over the top.
Was that Felton?
Joby Felton.
Did he get killed?
No. His brother was braking with me, and we got down to where this wreck was, and he said, "Where's Job?" I said, "I see him going over the top." I was up back, see? I see him going over the top there. He's probably in there someplace. He come up around the back side. He said, "I'm like hell." He went right into the creek. Off of that log, right down into the creek, and he come up around the other side of it. Wheels from one side and the other.
When the log cars were unloaded at the mill pond, workers had to unchain those 40-inch in diameter behemoth logs and guide them into the pond without getting crushed. Using PVs and quick reaction times as their only weapons, they had to do some real high stepping to accomplish their job. The mill was in constant motion, from logs being shot through the bandsaw to the edgers and planers' high-pitched scream. This was automation before the word had even been coined. Owen Chrisman's brother lost a leg in an accident at the mill.
It was a cold winter night, and the fuel chain that hauled the fuel up to go to the fuel shed was freezing up. And he was stomping that out, and his leg went down through one of the chain light. It was a square chain about 1 inch thick. And he seen where it was gone, so he caught onto a beam, and that's what took his leg off, because he knew he was going into the sprocket. The gear above it run the chain.
Sadly, the mill closed on a warm July day in 1941 when it ran out of its raw materials, trees. A big forest had been cut. Pennsylvania's logging and sawmill era officially shut down forever. Perhaps Emmett Pratt said it best.
Well, it just about completed their sawings in the big area. The big sawing was done. Big crop of timber was done.
Warren has a rich historical past associated with the Allegheny River and its tributaries. Archaeological excavations at the Buckaloons, 6 miles west of the city, have revealed human habitation dating back to 200 AD. Further research indicates that humans may have been there long before Christ. Native Americans occupied Rimrock, which overlooks the Kinzua Finger of the Allegheny Reservoir. Archaeological evidence dates his habitation to the 16th century. Rimrock is accessible by automobile and will certainly provide the visitor with a deeper appreciation of the past. Chief Corn Planter, a great Seneca chief and a contemporary of George Washington, lived in this area and is buried in a tiny cemetery near Willow Creek, overlooking the magnificent Allegheny Reservoir. In the mid-1740s, Celeron, a French explorer, traveled southwest on Lake Erie. Then he marched inland to Lake Chautauqua and continued south on the Conowanga Creek to where it flowed into the Allegheny River, the site of modern-day Warren, where he buried a lead plate and claimed the region for France. In the early 19th century, packet boat traffic existed on the river. Later came the discovery of oil near Oil City, 20 miles away, and a new industry was born. Simultaneously, the railroad boom occurred because of the completion of the Pennsylvania Railroad. These two events caused more industry to locate here. Ultimately, 4 oil refineries operated in Warren. Struthers Wells manufactured boilerplate and during World War II manufactured tank armor for the government. Sylvania also had a large plant located here. Soon, it became the largest city on the Pennsylvania line between Williamsport and Erie. The diamond that the Northern Express crosses over was the crossroad of two major lines, the Erie and the Pennsylvania Railroads. A 1936 schedule shows that every day between 7:25 a.m. until 8:15 a.m., passenger trains came through Corry with connections for New York City, Chicago, Cleveland, Erie, Buffalo, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. This passenger and freight service required a large transportation complex. Stations were located on a brick island between the Erie and the Pennsylvania tracks. Other related buildings for the railroads stretched over 100 yards on either side of the tracks. Railroad traffic in and out of Corry never slept. The railroad industry was good to Corry. The Climax Manufacturing Company manufactured railroad engines from 1888 to 1928. The company sold over 1,000 engines worldwide. The Climax narrow gauge engine revolutionized the logging era. Powerful, dependable, and safe, this little engine conquered rugged forest terrain from Pennsylvania to Virginia and then to the far west. Here at Union City, the Northern Express was but 10 miles from Erie, where it would stop for the evening. At Erie, the visitors had little time that evening other than to eat, stretch their collective legs, and get ready for the trip to Pittsburgh. There wasn't even time enough to tour any part of Erie, the state's only lakeport. The train was serviced during the night and made ready to move on at dawn's first light. The next morning, it was off and running again on the ex-New York Central line to Conneaut and then south to the Steel District at Pittsburgh on the Bessemer and Lake Erie. 7 miles north of Pittsburgh, it crossed the historic Allegheny River a few miles north of Washington's Crossing before joining the Union Railroad. Traveling by the Union Railroad's roundhouse, the Northern Express swept under the Route 22 viaduct and into the Turtle Creek Valley, passing near the sprawling Westinghouse plant in East Pittsburgh. From there, it went underneath the George Westinghouse Bridge and traveled adjacent to the Edgar J. Thompson Steel Mill. It then crossed the Monongahela River, where it powered around near the abandoned Duquesne Steel Works. It then retraced its path through Penn Hills and on to Butler, where it stopped for the evening. Here at Butler, wastewater and trash were removed, fresh water was supplied to the cars, the engines were refueled, and the train was inspected. Nothing seemed to escape Bennett Levin's eyes. However, he took a brief moment to meet with two rail fans. Obviously, he was the wagon master and was enjoying every minute of it. Everything had to be made ready for the last leg of the trip. A controlled type of confusion seemed to prevail as people and trucks went about their appointed duties. On the final leg of the trip, the Northern Express fell behind schedule because of minor track difficulties south of Punxsutawney. Upon arrival at Falls Creek, it had to power around so that the Pennsylvania car number 120 would again bring up the rear of the procession. Powering around obviously requires a huge amount of railway space. First, the vintage cars are unhooked from the 5711 and 5809. While the cars stay put, the two diesels pull slowly onto a siding. They travel about 700 yards where they are switched onto the old Pennsylvania low-grade line. Then they pull slowly past the diamond about 100 yards. The yard engines push the cars to the low-grade rails. After that, the yard engines unhook from the passenger cars and return to where they initially picked up the cars. Finally, the 5711 and 5809 cross the diamond and hook up with the waiting cars 150 yards away. The cars are slowly pulled across the diamond en route to Driftwood. Here are the names of the vintage cars of the Northern Express. The Caritas, the Pine Tree State, the Cimarron River, the Silver Quail, the Royal Street, the Silver Solarium, the Northern Dreams, the Palmetto State, the Watauga Valley, and the Pennsylvania 120. En route to Driftwood, the Northern Express traveled through the Caledonia Tunnel before entering scenic Cameron County. It is within a few miles from entering the Norfolk and Southern line, where it will speed south to Harrisburg and to its final destination, Philadelphia. As it approached Driftwood, the Northern Express had to stop. Bennett Levin's private car, the Pennsylvania, number 120, truly looks presidential, and indeed it is. Initially, the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad used it as his private car. President Harry Truman rode at least once in the car. President John F. Kennedy traveled round trip from Washington, D.C. to Philadelphia to attend the Army-Navy game in the car. The 120 also carried Robert Kennedy's body from New York City to Washington, D.C., where he was buried at Arlington Cemetery. With the train stopped, Mr. Levin came out of his car and spoke to some of the rail fans who were there. According to Levin, the cause of the delay was because the Northern Express had lost its slot on the track ahead. After an hour's wait, the northbound train passed by, giving a clear block to the Northern Express to continue to Harrisburg. As the presidential car slowly disappeared from view, the people who witnessed this event knew they had indeed seen something special. Driftwood, the jumping-off place for General Thomas L. Kane's Bucktail Regiment in 1861, was witness to still another great caravan to Harrisburg, the journey of the Northern Express.
Although the industries between Emporium and Warren played a huge role in helping defeat the Axis powers in World War II, many of these plants had closed their doors by 1975. This was the age of conglomerates. These mega corporations gobbled up plant after plant, not really caring about how their actions would affect individual communities. Like the tanneries, many factories were old and obsolete. The cost of modernization was simply too great. These plants went quietly into the night. Additionally, some industries fled to the Sun Belt, where the lure of cheap land and labor beckoned them. Finally, the railroads, which had brought life to the area 150 years ago, folded. Perhaps the interstate highway system was a factor. Maybe the labor costs were too high, or quite likely, the railroad's death came about due to mismanagement and arrogance of the railroad's owners. But the fact remains, with the demise of the railroads, a huge segment of the area's economy had disappeared. Fortunately, the towns on the old Pennsy line are survivors. They have struggled to recover from all of these terrible losses. The past is gone forever, but these communities carry on and bravely look forward to the future, recognizing the realities of a global economy.
St. Mary's is the carbon center of the nation. It probably has the most vibrant economy in Elk County. Many towns in the area have plants using powdered metal to manufacture primarily bearings for other industries. Over 60% of the powdered metal products manufactured in the United States are made in Elk County. Ridgway's fathers insisted on a very wide main street. This adds a certain charm to the town not seen elsewhere. The main street attests to the town's well-being. The Weyerhaeuser Company in Johnsonburg has invested millions of dollars into a modern paper mill that will remain efficient well into this new century. Wilcox has a couple of small powdered metal plants, but basically remains a bedroom community. It still is proud of its tree-lined streets and small-town tranquility. Kane and Sheffield rely heavily on wood and wood-related products for much of their industry. Oil refining is still the mainstay of Warren's economy, along with numerous other smaller manufacturers. The combination helps keep the town prosperous. The logging and sawmill industries, virtually dead in 1942, have made a remarkable recovery due to the wise stewardship of national, state, and private landholders. The lumber from the black cherry trees and oak trees found in Pennsylvania's northern tier are prized products throughout the world. Wood and wood-related products presently account for 25% of the economy of the five-county area. A significant addition to this economic mix is tourism. It has been sparked by the availability of year-long recreational activities, either on private or public lands. Significantly, the area is within a 10-hour drive of over 30 million people. Thus, with the influx of an increasingly greater number of tourists each year, all facets of the region's economy benefit. This area has breathtaking scenery almost around every bend of the road. The fall foliage display is second to none. In this hurly-burly, fast-paced world, a person can be whisked back into time 200 years just by canoeing on a secluded stream or by hiking through deep forests that envelop the region. Wildlife abounds. Turkey, white-tailed deer, and bears are all commonly seen. If one listens carefully, you may hear the bugling of a bull elk, and with little difficulty see these magnificent creatures. After a long absence, the bald eagles have returned to this area to thrill and delight us.
This area, once so profoundly affected by the railroads, has proven to be quite resilient. Octogenarian Deb Silvis, a Sheffield lumberman in the 1920s, helped create a remarkable history of the area. Like the area he lived and died in, Deb's legacy of toughness and durability has been passed on to the present generations. Historians tell us there could be no future if we do not know the past. The nostalgic odyssey of the Northern Express has carried us effortlessly back to the past, reminding us of what once was. It also has enabled us to see how change impacts upon everyone, whether it's a corporation, a town, or an individual. Hopefully, it might even make us think of where we're going, as the Northern Express slips back into a fog bank, back into the rivers of our mind. Let us not forget what we have learned by this journey.